Thank you to Khalid and your team for the warm welcome, for having us. It's an honor to be here and to see so many familiar, friendly faces. I'm joined by an excellent group of speakers here. These panelists are all experts in their fields, and I'm really excited to kind of join along with you guys and listen to this discussion and hear about the work that they're tackling. As we jump into this conversation today about religious extremism, authoritarian regimes, and the criminal networks that are threatening a lot of democratic stability around the world, I'm excited to really lean into Khalid's charge from this morning about finding practical outcomes or solutions that we might be able to apply to our work, and so that we can not just discuss some of these challenges, but really look at what some solutions may look like. Again, we'll be using the Slido app, so if you have questions as we're going through this discussion, please feel free to submit those. I'll be keeping an eye on it, so if I'm looking at my phone, I promise I'm not ignoring you guys. I'm just keeping an eye on those questions. But I'm really excited for us to jump into this. So, as kind of a starting place, I would love to just kind of open it up for all five of you to share a little bit about, when you look at this global landscape today, what do each of you see as maybe the single most urgent threat to democratic resilience, and why? Yeah, anyone can jump.
Yeah, so maybe I'm going to have slightly contrarian views here, but I should preface by saying I was struck last year by the differences around the world and with respect to these issues. I don't think the problems are at all the same. And also I'll confine my points to Canada and Western liberal democracies. I think it's in fact inability of the managerial class, large swaths of ruling elites in Western liberal democracies to recognize the excesses, overemphasis on openness. This idea that unrestrained freedom is license, the idea that open borders and ruthless cosmopolitanism can know no bounds, and to really offer no credible political solutions to deal with this. I think, in fact, it's opened the door for some of the negative types of populism to offer the solutions much to be desired. But so I would say that I would challenge liberals and libertarians to think really deeply about what are the proper bounds on freedom, liberty. Is it just license? Is it just radical openness? Or does it mean something else? I think our traditions offer very different responses to that. It's freedom for excellence. There's definitely a strong set of bounds and constraints that are required to make our societies flourishing and healthy. And I think it's even, I'll just give one example of how we think about measuring success. We think of technocratic measures, economic measures like GDP, like living standards, as the indicator, the gold standard for well-being. And on the contrary, I think there's some new studies that are getting deeper at some of these questions, that flourishing is not just the attainment of some of these indicators. It's things like deep bonds, commitments, stable relationships, family, marriage, belief in a transcendent power, a religiosity. All of these things are highly correlated with flourishing, understood in a better way. And I would encourage people to check out the Global Flourishing Study, which indicates this, that in fact, it's not people in the weird countries, white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, that are always doing the best, according to a more comprehensive, holistic approach. I think we need to learn from that.
Yeah, so I have a top 3, if that's okay, because it's too hard to pick just one. But one big challenge, I would say, is the lack of intellectual clarity. What is authoritarianism? What is extremism? And we tackled some of this with the opening addresses we heard earlier, but I'd like to actually share an insight I learned I heard last week at the World Liberty Congress in Berlin, one of the speakers at the awards dinner framed it as authoritarianism or tele-authoritarianism is a lack of peaceful transition of power. And I thought that was very good because, as we heard earlier, even Putin has elections, right? You know, Dr. Kylie Moore Gilbert, when she was a hostage in Iran, was put through a trial, air quotes, trial. So how do we define authoritarianism? And I thought that was quite good, that there's lack of peaceful transition of power. And then what is extremism, right? We see that a lot with, after October 7, is Hamas a terrorist organization or freedom fighters, you know, the protests on the street? And I think we need to, you know, consider that as well and really come to clear answers on what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. The second of my top three is our failures to deal properly with the growing authoritarian nexus. Because we're not just dealing with China, Russia, with Iran, with Venezuela, et cetera. We're dealing with their cooperation and their collaboration. And this growing authoritarian nexus also includes non-state actors. It includes front organizations. It includes terrorist groups, Hamas being sponsored by Iran. The growing, deepening connections between Cuba and Russia and Cuba and China are also worth considering. And our failure so far to address that leads to loopholes. I'll give one example. When I was representing the Human Rights Coalition, together with David Bates at the Federal Foreign Interference Inquiry, we played a clip for the commissioner, a 2.5-minute clip of Cuba Vision, which is not banned on Canadian airwaves, rebroadcasting Russia Today programming. Very brazenly, both logos were side by side, and they just rebroadcasted an interview that was not playing in Canada on Russia Today. And the anchor actually opened with saying, we're broadcasting this so people who may not have access can watch it. So the failure of Canadian government so far to properly address that connection between Cuba and Russia in this case led to a clear gap in terms of the enforcement of the banning of Russia Today. The third top challenge is transnational repression. And I just want to flag this as a key subset of foreign interference because it's important to emphasize that it's not just authoritarian regimes targeting our institutions. They're targeting our people, and they're targeting those most vulnerable in Canada. New refugees, newcomers who have fled from authoritarian regimes, seeking safety and not finding it because we have failed so far to address that. So those are my top three.
Well done, everyone, today. The first that I come from the top of my mind, it's honesty. We need to really open your mind, take aside every reference that we have from totalitarian regimes and international organizations that we learned from previous conflicts, take everything aside and we start to work from zero. These organizations are no longer regular totalitarian regimes. Now they are work like international criminal enterprise. Countries or groups that we never see them work together before, now they are partnered because they have a common enemy, us. We start to call the things for the right name. We are in so many countries, for example, like Venezuela, most specific, in low intensity war. We are in a war. People is afraid to use this word, but we are in a low intensity war, and it started by the regime since 2006. Not all the wars are the same. For war generations, we are in a low-intensity war against Western culture and Western countries. There is a real weaponizing of the immigration. I know for organizations like mine, Ladies of Liberty Alliance, we defend the open borders. However, that's libertarian values are connected with the self-regulation of the individual. But when the background of that individual is not connected with self-regulation is when those individuals liberties crossed to another way. Not every immigrant, as a refugee and an immigrant myself, comes to countries like Canada with good intentions. We need to search in their backgrounds. It's not, we cannot call it like discrimination or weak and unfair, but this is our house and we need to know who we are getting in our country. Imagine that Canada is your personal house. You don't open the door of your house and get in people that you don't know and you don't have any reference from them to enter to your house. And we need to leave behind the afraid of all the scenes with the right name. There is an actual weaponized use that come even from the United Nations with all those programs of open border and receive immigrants. Yes, there is refugees that need help, but there is organization that is weaponizing these people in need and use massive volume of immigrants to hide operative. A specific case from Venezuela, the government of Venezuela gives them Venezuelan passport to Iranian operative and members from the Quds forces and from Hezbollah and China and other operatives. That means that when they come to countries like Canada asking for asylum, you receive someone with a Spanish name, but in reality is an operative from those groups. And they take advantage and they weaponize the goodwills of countries like Canada, and they weaponize the lack of level of checking background of that people who is entry to this country. And they act for a long time for like dormant self. I was shocking when I confirmed something 2 weeks ago. There is an interview of the director of counter-terrorism of the RCMP in Canada that confirmed the presence of 7 gangs, Latin American gangs in Canada, the active presence of them. And one of them is the Aragua train. Was a bigger surprise for me is realize that the liberal government actually included those organizations as a terrorist group, and nobody knows. It's an information that was not disclosed publicly. And when we met with politicians from the different sides in our government, and you approach them to explain that complaint presented by President Trump about the lack of security between Canada and US border, he is actually telling the truth. And we need to understand that it's not bad when we actually check the background of these people that is coming to Canada, because we have to put in first place the security and the protection of the Canadian citizens. This is the major thing, or my major conclusion is that we have to learn to see out of the box. We need to understand that these people work as adaptive organizations. Let's make an example easy. If they are like water, that they will take the form of the container, and they can be adapted to any system. They have a very strong team who study the legal framework from the countries, and they know how to penetrate and take advantage of the weaknesses of those legal frameworks and everything in countries like Canada and other countries.
If I could try to build on something that Sarah was talking about, which was trying to define religious extremism. I think religious extremism has 3 problems that it can lead to. Those are promoting intolerance, which can lead to violence or other ways of coercing people to believe the same things you believe. It can lead to isolation, and it can lead to inequality. So another problem that democracies face is reacting too far in the other direction, and specifically through aggressive secularism or through anti-religious sentiments or prejudices. And these also have those same three problems that religious extremism has. They promote inequality, intolerance, and they isolate people. Both of these extremes divide people into categories and then justify treating certain groups worse than others. So I think conferences like this are so important because they promote religious moderation. Religion has a lot of good things to offer the world. Religion promotes community, it teaches virtues, promotes charity, honesty. So we need to try to retain the benefits of religion without getting the harms of religious extremism. And so I think what we're all doing in this room and what we all need to continue to do is find ways to advocate within each respective religious tradition why those moderate forms of faith are the ones that are most likely to be true.
Thank you, Hunter. It's a pleasure to be here. I will give a complementary different perspective of what is a big challenge nowadays that connect to any country around the world, which is we live a strong challenge of understanding the impact of our culture and our identity. We live a cultural crisis, which means population is not being able to understand what a culture means. What are the values, what are the principles behind a culture? And when it's not clear, so if you get an example of the business market, I'm from more business side than academics. If you see the most succeed companies, those are the ones who have a strong culture. They reinforce every day what they expect from the employees. What are their values, their principles? And that allows them to grow and generate a strong impact. If you see, on the other hand, countries, how many countries have you seen that once a president is elected, he brings back what the culture should be? What are the values, the principles that the country should defend? What is the mission, the value, how we bring prosperity back? So having said that, we have a challenge which is within this world of massive information, population has two challenges: lack of intellectual intelligence, emotional intelligence, and understanding how to communicate. So once you are fragile and not strained on your culture and influenced by a lack of communication and emotional intelligence, that comes to a sense that authoritarianism gets a lot of influence on yourself. In families, in population, and the population gets fragile to defend, to bring back what is true, what they believe. So this is an important perspective that we should reinforce, that impacts, that I see even like in most of the countries. I'm from Brazil. Brazil has a strong challenge on this. Even moving to Canada and living here 2 years, I see the same challenge. So I want to connect that later with this sense of understanding what virtues means, what those values and principles means, so we walk through the same path of generating prosperity.
Thank you guys for giving us such great places to start. I think, like Stefano, what you're talking about, some of the trends that you've seen in Brazil, makes me curious about, Peter, if you might be able to help us dig in a little bit about if you've seen some of the issues or challenges that Nathan mentioned regarding religious moderation or maybe the lack thereof, and how that may be contributing to some issues when we think about religious radicalism, or how we're really going to lean into healing from such a thing. Nathan, I'll let you start us off if there's any additional context you want to provide to that religious idea there as far as that middle ground. Peter, I'll have you jump in, and then Sarah, I think I might ask you to maybe shed a little bit of light, maybe from that legal standpoint, about what you're saying as well.
Sure, so to provide some more context, religious extremism unjustly treats those who do not share one's own faith, but extreme secularism unjustly treats those who have moderate forms of religion. So both are ways of dividing people and encouraging inequality. So one of the terms we've heard this morning and last night quite a bit was human dignity. Why do we believe in freedom in this room? We believe that just in virtue of being human, people possess an inalienable intrinsic dignity and moral status, and that in virtue of that, they deserve to be treated equally to other people and in ways that respect that dignity. So I think both extremism and extreme secularism compromise that dignity, and religious moderation is a good way to uphold dignity while also retaining some of those benefits that religion has that I mentioned.
So this made me think of a quote by a very influential, not so profound thinker in my view, who's had a great impact and I think got this right. He said, you know, of the choice to have no fashion is itself a fashion choice. And so too with religion. Religion speaks to a category of reality. And so and it is in some sense a comprehensive framework for understanding the world. And so political philosophies and ideologies like liberalism, libertarianism, fascism, what have you, they enter into this domain when we're talking about the foundational principles, and they can be weaponized to be extreme and exclusionary. And so I would certainly agree with Nathan that religious extremism is a problem, and extremism of any kind. And we live in a society, you know, here in Canada and other Western countries that are excessively religiously extreme in the secular, autonomy obsessed, choice obsessed, where all values and lifestyles need to be equalized. It really, I think, pulls against some deep anthropological features of human existence. Like, we need bonds, we need ties, we need to foster those relationships over time, and we can't do it through just pressing the freedom button, right? It requires other things. And so I think we see social fragmentation in Canada in particular. We've spent the past few decades talking about Canada being the first post-national state, you know, and having no identity. So it's this idea that is kind of diversity and pluralism all the way down. You know, we're famed, and rightly so, for a successful model of multiculturalism to a certain extent, and immigration. We've done it right, more or less, for a long period of time. But, you know, multiculturalism without any integration and just focus on diversity is contrary to unity, I would say, you know, quite clearly. And some other features of this very hyper-individualistic lifestyle that again come up against some of the realities and important features of human anthropology. You know, the relationship between the sexes and the consequences for, you know, fertility and family formation. This idea that we're all, you know, androgynous, interchangeable, you know, fully equal and undifferentiated beings is having pretty profound impacts across our whole society. And you know, men and women are struggling to couple up, to find their way. And we see, you know, life dissatisfaction across men and women, and one would think it's in fact more pronounced among women, and one would expect that with this ideal of, you know, ever greater liberation and equality would be the opposite. But in fact, you know, some of these ideals, I think, just ignore human nature and reality. And so we're facing impending demographic challenges that are going to threaten our economic viability, the viability of our entitlement systems and our social programs. And so I think a roundabout way of saying, yes, like we need to be mindful of extremism and recognize that it can occur in all different types of belief systems and ideologies, and that the problems are different wherever you look around the world. And I'm always struck by talking to Khalid that it is so radically different in Afghanistan and other places, and we shouldn't expect it to be the same here. Different problems, different solutions.
I'd like to go back to that earlier, Nathan, the challenge you spoke about in terms of going too far in the other direction and extreme secularism. And it occurred to me that when we're dealing with different autocratic regimes, they fall under either camp, right? You have the Taliban, obviously, which is religiously extreme, and then you have China, which is aggressively secular and targets religious minority groups on a regular basis. David and I started recently working with a House Christian community, and it's the same tactics across different groups, but what they have in common is these are groups that aren't aggressively atheist a lot of the time. So I think that's an important point to keep in mind. And when we're looking at how to combat that, of course that's my specialty, right? Using the law to combat authoritarianism. I think it's important to leverage a variety of tactics, regardless of whether the regime is aggressively religious or aggressively secular. And this is something I wanted to focus on today. As you said, Hunter, what do we do from here? Where do we go? And I think Canada really needs to leverage its laws, and our communities need to leverage international law and domestic law, because we have tools available at our disposal. We can impose targeted sanctions, or rather we can ask government to do so, and government can do so. We can engage in strategic civil litigation. We can pursue criminal prosecutions, universal jurisdiction prosecutions. There's so much that we can do, but international law and domestic law, for that matter, largely relies on our will to use it, relies on implementation, relies on consistent enforcement. And I think those are some of the things we need to focus on as well.
Yeah, I think, Sarah, that's such a great place for us to build on. Mention that the laws are necessary, but it's also necessary to apply them and can build on them. I'd love to jump over to Alessa and Stefano to maybe build a little bit on what we discussed earlier, where we see some of these regimes that are flaunting the law, and we kind of see what that next step or what that late stage could look like. And so I'd be curious to hear from both of you maybe a little bit about some of the tactics that you guys are seeing from these regimes. Stefano, in Brazil, there's a lot that's focused on censorship. Alessa, you outlined a lot as well, but you guys tell us a little bit about some of those challenges that you're seeing, as far as maybe we need to understand more about the dynamic of these authoritarian regimes and the tools they're using when we're looking at what could happen in other places as well.
The first statement from Hugo Chavez, the day he was sworn as a president of Venezuela, he put his hands on the Constitution and he said, "I swear on this dead Constitution." The first thing that he did in the initial government was replace the Venezuelan Constitution. He created his own legal framework to make everything illegal legal. He terrorized the law and everything inside the country. The second thing, and if I go and find out some equivalence with Canada, we haven't seen in the last 10 years the change of so many bills. Because our actual active constitution, more than the Charter of Freedom, are the bills that are written in our parliament. And they have been changed since the day one that we have the current government in Canada. And we see, I honestly can identify so many things in common, so many steps that we went through from dismantle our liberties and our democracy in Venezuela. And the first thing was the freedom of speech. They create some many laws that people is incarcerated to to speak in social media. The first things that Chavez did in Venezuela was shut down all the international media channels, all the national radio stations. The first year they closed 250 radio stations. And we just listen in the national TV, just one version, the government version. Is the VTV, which is the Venezuelan National News TV. And it's just the version of the regime that reached everyone in their houses. The third step that the regime did was dismantle the separation of powers. Legislation, judiciary, everything is under the control of the regime. Doesn't matter. One of the biggest examples that we have to indoctrinate people or to make people be afraid, you don't need to kill 1,000 people. You just need to kill one person before 1,000 people. And they used as an example Maria Lourdes Afiuni. She was a judge. And she was put in jail because she followed the law and she released a political prisoner who was in jail without process for 4 years. And when the case reached her desk, she released him. And 15 minutes after, the regime police took her in custody and she was condemned to 30 years of incarceration in national TV. That was the lesson from all the legal structure and the judiciary in the country that say, if you don't do what I said, that is going to be the result. That means that everyone go and be under the control in the judiciary of the regime. And everything was in that step. I remember when we went through to the analyze or the inquire for the Emergency Act, and they decide the government is the one who appointed the judge for the inquirement related with the Emergency Act, and they absolutely control the result, and they say, no, that was okay, is a good decision to implement the Emergency Act. And the Emergency Act is the same process that we went through so many times in Venezuela, which is the suspension of the civil liberty. And people, they don't really, the normal citizen, they don't understand that kind of thing and those processes. But even in the elections, Venezuela has been the laboratory to test the innumerable ways to rig an election, believe it or not. Every process with machine, manual, redistribution of the electoral district areas, the manipulation of the citizenship, bring immigrants who are not citizens and let them vote in our election, the persecution of the candidates, the destruction of their moral reputation in media, and to condemn the opposition and practically demonize the opponents, to make them look like the worst option and divide. This is the most oldest strategy, is divide and conquer. They know how to manipulate emotions. They know how to pop people and use fear to take the wrong decision. But you need take so much courage to confront them, and in some point get out of your circle comfort and get out to the street and fight. We have in Venezuela to go to different alternative ways to explain what is going on inside the country, because we were in a informative blockout. The version of the regime, I remember in 2012 here in Canada, in one of the stations of the Subcommittee of International Human Rights, that they actually continue calling Hugo Chavez a freedom fighter because he's against the empire, the United States, but they don't have the time to look that in that point the amount of political prisoners that we have, the missing person, the persecution that we went through in the country. I think that we need look outside of the box, start to connecting the dots and learn from others' countries' experience and compare, and maybe we can see, oh, this element is happening here, more subtle, but it happened. And I really believe that all those totalitarian regimes like China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, they are working together and they are taking advantage of the weaknesses of our democracy.
So, first of all, let me involve a little bit the audience. Who here have never been to Brazil? Please raise your hand. So all the rest have been to Brazil. So I'm gonna bring a bit of context about Brazil. Brazil, it's a very warm country in all perspective, in weather perspective and in emotional perspective. It's a very, it's a population that debates a lot, discuss, but has a lot of challenges also of communication. Brazil, it is a democracy, but over the past 7 years, we have been seeing a lot of negative trends that have been challenging our democracy. So what has been happening is that, a bit of more context, after the military decade on the 60s, when, by the way, was the time that Brazil grew most, average of 7 to 9% per year, what happened is that we lived on what we call the scissors theater, which is a moment of, until 2022, that two parties, the left and the right, used to play in between who would control the country. Both of them, even the right side, being a socialist party, but positioning as a right side. So what happened is that after a sense of a disruption in 2022, that this sense of urgent change made the population and influencers help change and bring a new right conservative president. What happened is that the system saw that they were losing control. So it started trends like controlling the free speech. So going into this topic, the first trends that started was in 2022, when we had more than 230, there is no clear number, but there are so many influencers that were blocked. So their accounts were blocked like 3 months before the elections, and that's just like unacceptable for a democracy, right? With that in mind, like other things that happens, like for example, the influence of the Supreme Court started to be in doubt because they were blocking that account. They blocked X. So X, like a huge social media with strong influence, were blocked. All accounts. And they were saying like the ones who used X would be like charge an amount of money because it was prohibited during that time. And that's just unacceptable. So that shows a trend of a negative bad management. And all of that somehow as an influence of authoritarian leader, is not even leader of the world, but authoritarian from the Supreme Court. So when that happened, it started to be in doubt, like if Brazil is still a strong democracy as a G4 country. A few more conclusions of this challenge. When that starts to happen, bring us to the sense of a fragile population of being worried to say what they think. So free speech starts to be fragile, right? And other things that have been happening with this authoritarian influence of like 2-3 mans in the Supreme Court. For example, like after the elections, they started to bring them back, like they invited like almost 30 influencers from the left side to join the government and learn the things they would need to communicate. And that's just another example. So all those facts bring to the sense that United States have done a great job. By the way, it's the first time in history that the Supreme Court leader was acted by the Magnitsky law from the United States. So due to time here, what is happening is like we do face a strong challenge on free speech, and we need to defend how to maintain our democracy. It's still a country that has somehow less challenges than our neighbors, but if Brazil loses this influence, I would say Latin America loses it all. So happy to share more, and that's due to the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's a million more things I want to ask each of you, but I'm aware that us Californians are not always the most punctual, so I do want to respect everyone's time. As we wrap up with just a couple more minutes, I'd love to hear, if possible, but it's hard to kind of boil it down, about 30 seconds from each of you. What is maybe one action, whether it's legal, civic, social, and institutional action, that could help strengthen democracy in the next couple of years, something practical that people here can leave with that we think really would lead us to healing the world when we're facing such authoritarianism and religious radicalism. I know it's a tall order, but let's see if we can do it.
Well, the first thing, start to work together. All the areas, all the religions or the commons, we are aligned in the same values. We really, really urgently need to work together and join forces. And the second thing, the art of the war, and Sun Tzu said, know your enemy. We need to identify our enemy, and then we can develop the strategy to stop them and to protect ourselves.
I would like to speak to the tone and the spirit with which we go about our work. People here have proposed policy lists that we should implement, specific action items, but I think how we go about this really matters. At risk of sounding overly naive and simplistic, two ways to change the world are through hate and through love. Now, hate is effective. You can solve problems with hate, but you'll always create new problems in doing so. I think only love can change the world. And if we look at our respective religious traditions, we see in the Torah that hatred stirs up strife, but love can conquer many sins. In the New Testament, it tells us that we should overcome evil with good. The Quran tells us to repel evil with good, and the one who was your enemy will become like an intimate friend. Virtues like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control are listed in the New Testament. as virtues we should all aspire to. But I think if you go through that list, those are also the virtues of freedom. Those are values that freedom promotes. And so tomorrow when we go back to our work promoting freedom, I think that should be the spirit with which we do it.
Beautifully said. I'll try to build on that, similar themes. I think we need to, and in a measured way, as you say, Nathan, reject the false sense of neutrality and proceduralism and avoidance of discussions of substantive questions of the good that can unite society by reintroducing substantive, moral, philosophical, religious discourse into politics. Because I think it's been eroded, and the human heart cries out and longs for these things inherently, and when they are suppressed inappropriately, we see negative consequences. So I think in a measured way, be introducing some of that language and discussion into our public discourse.
So, going back to the first thing you mentioned about culture, values, and principle, I believe our very agile action should be starting with ourselves in our families to really explain what freedom values means. It took for myself, I would say, like 30 years to be exposed to those values, which means the education system is somehow like it should be changed. Like it took me 30 years to understand Hayek, Mises, and Ayn Rand, like authors that it's somehow so important for our lives. So my action is really changing education systems, looking for that, and starting with our families, passing that to our children, our neighbors, our cousins, everyone around us, to be exposed to those values and bring that to education as soon as possible to avoid taking too long to understand it.
And this is something I said at the very beginning, but I'll say it again. Consistent enforcement of the law, principled enforcement of the law, no matter which country is doing the victimizing, whether it's China or Cuba, really using that across all cases to protect victims, and doing it in a victim-centered way. My first mentor out of law school taught me to use the law as a shield and not a sword. And the second one taught me to do the work out of love for the victims and not hatred for the perpetrators. So I think that's again, going with the tone, I think we need to use the law consistently and do it that way.
You guys have given us a lot to think about. I am really looking forward to continuing this conversation, whether it's a coffee break or even over email. I've got a lot more that I'm curious to learn from you guys, but I want to thank you for joining us and sharing your work with us all today. And I look forward to continuing the panel or the conference. Thank you, everyone.